EV mandate itself is not sustainable. The targets that have been established cannot be met, and that will be part of the discussion.
Well, hello, friends, and welcome to episode 17 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Thank you so much for being with us. A lot to get to on this episode. Coming up later, we'll look at Canada's media landscape. We'll chat with Peter Menzies, former Calgary Herald publisher, former CRTC vice chair. He's with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, The Hub, his own Substack, The Rewrite. An interesting debate is raging once again about whether there's an anti-conservative bias at the CBC. We'll get into that story. Also, how is the Carney government going to approach the whole issue of funding the CBC? Not to mention some of Trudeau's bailouts for other private media companies. That's still to come. But first, let's talk about electric vehicles and how heavy-handed the government is prepared to be in making sure that at some point you purchase an electric or a zero-emissions vehicle. Now, the voice you just heard a moment ago was that of Brian Kingston. He's with the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. The CVMA, along with representatives from Ford, Stellantis, and GM, met with Prime Minister Mark Carney earlier this month to make their plea to the government to amend or to back down from the zero-emissions vehicle mandate. Now, we're on the verge of this coming into force, or at least the first phase of it. 2026 is the target date for this 20% threshold. That is, 20% of all new vehicles in Canada will have to be zero-emissions vehicles as of next year. And that number increases all the way to 100% by 2035. Now look, there are very valid reasons to be worried here. For consumers, there's understandable concern about the cost of buying an electric vehicle, the reliability of these vehicles in our climate, and the availability of reliable charging infrastructure. Perhaps not surprisingly, a recent poll shows that Canadians aren't on board with this approach. The Nanos CTV News poll shows 67% opposed and only 30% of Canadians saying they support the mandate. And let's face it, cost, reliability, those are pretty important factors to somebody buying a vehicle. I mean, there's something to be said for saving on fuel costs, for example, and yes, the technology has advanced considerably. China is apparently making great strides in EV technology. But therein lies part of the rub here for Canadian governments. Is this about consumers? Is this about the environment? Or is this about the domestic auto industry? I mean, we could open up the floodgates to cheap Chinese electric vehicles. Those currently, by the way, have massive tariffs applied to them. But if we did that, that would devastate domestic production. But at the same time, forcing the industry to meet these targets could be detrimental, maybe even devastating as well. There's a cost to manufacturers when it comes to producing electric vehicles, and the demand just isn't where it needs to be. With the policy direction changing south of the border, it's going to make it even harder for the automakers to meet these targets. So you would think, with all the money that's gone into supporting the auto sector, and likely more to come, that it's very odd for the government to simultaneously implement a policy that's going to cause harm to the very sector they're trying to prop up. Now, when asked earlier this week about the government's approach on this file, Industry Minister Mélanie Joly was somewhat non-committal. Here's what she said.
There are two things. First, we know that there are illegal tariffs against the auto industry, which are completely unacceptable, and we're fighting against them. And we know that the industry is facing huge challenges because of these tariffs. So we're working on a auto support fund worth $2 billion. So we're in solution mode there, while also imposing counter tariffs. At the same time, we know that we need to help the industry to modernize itself. And we know that there's been lots of investments in the electric vehicle sector. So we think we can do both. We think that we can be very pragmatic to make sure that we support the sector, and at the same time we can help with this adoption of new vehicles. And in that context, we're having many conversations about it, and we'll have more to say in the coming weeks.
Okay, so that was Industry Minister Mélanie Joly asked about the government's direction here. Well, our next guest has studied this issue very closely, including a recent paper published in the peer-reviewed Canadian Journal of Economics. Ross McKitrick is a professor of economics at the University of Guelph and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. Professor McKitrick, great to have you here with us.
Thank you, Rob.
So first of all, what do we need to know about this mandate? 2035 is I guess, when it would be fully implemented, but what would it look like?
Well, it actually starts in 2026. So the 2026 model year would require 20% of new vehicles to be EVs. I think currently somewhere between 6 and 8% are EVs. The problem that we're facing right now, there is EV take-up. You can see lots of them on the road. Some people quite like them. But they're a bit of a niche market still. Typically, buyers take them as second vehicles or people in cities who only do a little bit of running around. But for a lot of uses, especially in Canada, they just aren't practical. The other big problem with them is the automakers lose a lot of money on them. Ford is the only one that reports the results separately, and currently they're losing about $100,000 per vehicle. The cost of making them far exceeds what the market's willing to bear. So if you're going to force automakers to focus exclusively on a sector of the market where they're losing money hand over fist, it's the end of the industry. And that's the message that the automakers are trying to convey to Ottawa, that under current technology, the EV mandate is the end of the auto industry in Canada.
Well, and that's important to know because, this is an industry that clearly the government is very concerned about. So it does seem strange in a way, I guess, isn't it, that Ottawa would pursue policy that would be detrimental to the auto sector?
It's very strange, although honestly, it's not the only case where governments pursue very strange policies when it comes to things to do with energy and climate. But the automakers have been showing Ottawa and the provinces the numbers going back at least 10 years on this, and it hasn't slowed down the policy making. Quebec, for instance, completely ignored the auto sector when they presented these kinds of findings and went ahead with their own provincial mandate. Now, Quebec also provided large subsidies for buyers, which partly cushioned the blow. And that's been Ottawa's approach as well. British Columbia, same thing. But those subsidy programs come to an end, and as we've seen nationally, when the subsidies end, the sales end. And so it's not a sustainable plan at this point. You can't build a sector with so many losses. And the study that I did, which was in the Canadian Journal of Economics, really just confirmed at the macroeconomic level that the losses under foreseeable technology will be so large and last for so long that it's just not going to work as planned.
The funny thing is, we right now have pretty substantial tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles. One option if Canada was intent on meeting this target would be to just open the floodgates, but that too would destroy the Canadian auto sector, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It's a bit of an irony there that around the same time as they were reiterating they're going to follow through on the EV mandate, they've also put in a 100% tariff on Chinese EV imports. About the only way that the EV mandate would be feasible, at least on the short term, would be if people could buy these really inexpensive Chinese-made vehicles, although we don't really know how long they'll last and what do we do with all the waste when the cars and the batteries die.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting point. I think, we look at it then through that lens of, well, this is supposed to be environmental policy, not necessarily industrial policy. But, we compare this to other environmental policies, or we try to put a price if we're using this EV mandate to reduce emissions, then, never mind some of the other environmental impacts that go into this technology. It seems like a really inefficient or a costly way of reducing emissions.
Yes, so the calculations I did show that you do get some emission reductions from forcing a switch to EVs, but they come at a cost at least 10 times as high as the current carbon tax. So even if you're just thinking, let's do this for greenhouse gas reasons, it's among the least efficient ways to do this. Bear in mind that as the vehicle fleet turns over, it turns over rather slowly. There are a lot of gas-powered cars still on the road, and the more EVs are on the road, the lower the price of gas goes because there's less demand for gasoline. And so the remaining vehicle fleet actually is driven more. So that really cuts into the effectiveness of the policy as an emissions reduction scheme.
Does it also, does it limit government's ability then to pursue environmental policy in other ways? The concern's been raised about a drop-off in tax revenue from gasoline sales, for example. I assume here there's an expectation, too, that government foot a lot of the bill when it comes to building up infrastructure to support electric vehicles. If those costs fall on government, how does that hamstring government moving forward?
Yeah, there isn't really an upside for the government because, as you point out, they're having to heavily subsidize the production side. You saw these giant gifts to the auto sector for the EV battery plants in Ontario. Mm-hmm. So they're subsidizing the production side, and then they have to subsidize the buyers because the cars are still too expensive for people to buy them. And then, yes, you're right, it's a loss of revenue on the gasoline sales ultimately. Under the current plan, after 2035, the government wouldn't be making any money at all on gas tax revenue, which is a big source of revenue for highway building. So then they'd need to come up with a new revenue model for how you pay for road maintenance.
It's interesting, too, because a few years ago, right, when we still had the Biden administration, there was a big push toward electric vehicles, and we were almost kind of riding the coattails off of that, right? The U.S. administration was really trying to encourage uptake in electric vehicles. It seemed like the automakers were following suit, and maybe from a Canadian perspective, it felt like this was going to be easy. This was the direction that things were going. But how short-sighted was that, do you think?
Well, it's definitely a new technology and a new market. I think in the early days, people might have been thinking this will be like the way CDs took over from vinyl records, or just some great technological improvement. You don't need to force people; they just gladly switch. Same with switching to mobile phones instead of landlines. Just for convenience and superior technology. But that wasn't the case with EVs. There's certainly a lot of innovations happening, and they're apparently lovely vehicles. I don't have one myself, but people really like them. But like I say, it's still a small segment of the auto market. And so what the Biden administration ran into was very similar to what we're running into, which is the car companies can't survive. They can't make any money. So the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. just force-fed a lot of subsidies into the system. And then once that was suspended by the new Trump administration, the whole EV market crashed. And now that the Trump administration has removed the EV mandate in the U.S., that also changes things for us because those battery plants that we were subsidizing, they were meant to supply the U.S. market, which has largely vanished on us now. So at every level of it, I think the story is the technology will continue to improve. This is a market that will continue to grow, but it'll grow at its own pace. And if the government tries to force it to move on an artificial pace, it will fail, and it will be an expensive failure.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if this continues to grow and if there is the demand, then great. And maybe there are other ways that governments can sort of nudge people in that direction or encourage that demand. But, the idea of some heavy-handed mandates and having 100% of EV sales by 2035, that really doesn't line up with these demand trends. So is it best then for governments to just say, okay, well, we'll try to encourage this maybe as an option for consumers, but we can't have these sort of mandates?
I think so. The auto sector is a huge part, especially of the Ontario economy. It's one of the most significant consumer purchases that people make. It playing that big a role in the economic lives of the country, they can't afford to mess it up. Regardless of the mandate, so I think what people should also understand is there will be a scale of adoption that takes place as the technology improves and preferences change. And it really doesn't matter what the government does. As of 2035, even if they try to remain fixed on their mandate schedule, because it just won't work, the mandate won't in the end make much of a difference. You can't force companies to make products that will drive them into bankruptcy, and you can't force people to buy products that they fundamentally can't afford and don't want. All you'll do is provoke backlash and people working around it somehow. But on the current technology and at the current pace of technological improvement, I think the automakers have a very compelling message, and I just hope that Ottawa is listening to them.
Yeah, I mean, even though 2035 is a decade away, as you say, the first stage of this comes into force next year, which would be a 20% sales mandate. So how quickly or how soon does Ottawa need to make a decision here if we are indeed going to pivot?
Oh, it's actually pretty late right now. I mean, you're talking about the 2026 model year, and the companies are already having to make significant decisions about tooling up factories and changing product lines, but also just trying to figure out how you do it. How do you, if the customers come in and let's say the demand pattern is that they're willing to 5% are willing to take EVs, and the rest want standard gasoline vehicles. What are the automakers supposed to do? Now, in my analysis, I assume that what they'll do is start hiking the price of the gasoline-powered vehicles to drive people over to the EV side of the showroom. How high a price hike is required, we don't yet know. There isn't really good evidence on that. But people are going to start seeing that this fall when they begin thinking about placing orders for 2026 vehicles. They may notice, even if they think, well, I'm not buying an EV, so it doesn't matter, you're going to get hit with the price hike on the gasoline side.
Well, we'll see where it all goes from here. More in your research, rossmckitrick.com. Ross, appreciate your insight on this. Thank you so much for making some time for us here.
Thanks, Rob. Nice talking to you.
Once again, that is Ross McKitrick. He's a professor of economics at the University of Guelph. He's a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute, and has mentioned this recent paper he published in the Canadian Journal of Economics, looking at very much the economic downsides of the government's EV mandates. So we'll see if they back off. Now, coming up in a moment, some questions about government direction on another policy as it pertains to the media. Specifically, we'll talk about the CBC. I mean, it's interesting, the recent federal election. The Conservatives were talking about defunding the CBC. The Liberals, in contrast, were talking about spending more on the CBC. Now, the Conservatives didn't win the election. We don't know what a Conservative approach would have looked like. We're still trying to figure out what the Liberal approach is with regard to the CBC. In fact, story this week suggesting that the Carney government is maybe looking at some cuts at the CBC. Maybe that's an opportunity to reform the public broadcaster, to rethink the mandates of the public broadcaster. So we'll get into that, but also a story that emerged this week that I think plays into this whole conversation, the question of bias at CBC, the departure of a high-profile CBC star, and some allegations he's made about bias at the public broadcaster. We're going to hear in a moment here from Peter Menzies, a longtime veteran of the media industry, publisher with the Calgary Herald. He was a vice chair at the CRTC. He writes for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, for the hub.ca, for his own Substack, The Rewrite. We'll get his insight on some of these stories. As it pertains, too, to the broader approach to the media sector. You know, the Trudeau government was very much about bailouts, some more money for the media in this country, trying to get money out of big tech to pay for all of that. And I mean, clearly that approach hasn't gone well. So we'll get into all of that coming up in a moment. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Our next guest is a former publisher of the Calgary Herald, former vice chair at the CRTC. He's also a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and co-host of the Full Press podcast at the hub.ca. Peter Menzies is with us here today. Peter, great to have you with us.
It's a pleasure as always. Good to see you again. Well, actually, I didn't see you before. I just listened to you.
Yeah, I suppose so. Let's talk about what's going on at the CBC. And a lot of controversy right now after the departure of one of their high-profile, or now former high-profile TV stars. A lot of questions, once again, about editorial judgment, bias at the CBC. What do people need to know about this situation here, first of all?
Well, the first thing we need to know is that so far we've only heard one side of the story. And to be fair, there is always another side to the story, at least one. So I'm sure CBC has its side. I doubt that we will hear it publicly. That's not usually done. But we need to keep that in mind. The other thing that it means, though, is it's come at a time when the CBC has been under serious scrutiny for a long time by people in different regions of the country and people of conservative persuasion or contrarian persuasion, people of a variety of views, who see the CBC as pretty monolithic, that it deals with a pretty narrow Overton window, that being the range of opinions it deems to be acceptable. And I think is, beating up pretty badly in the last week and a half, an already difficult reputation, at least for the television portion of CBC.
Why do you think it matters, right? I mean, there's been so much conversation about the future of the CBC, what we want or expect the public broadcaster to be. Why does this matter to Canadians, do you think?
I think the thing that seems to get under most people's, the wedge that bothers most people is that they're paying for it, is that each of us have to pay for it. If I want to subscribe to the Globe and Mail, I can subscribe to the Globe and Mail. And if I don't like it, I stop subscribing. And it doesn't cost me anything. Same with, say, the National Post or the Toronto Star or pick one. But when your money is going to something directly, there is an expectation that you will be served by that entity in some way, shape, or form. And if you don't hear your voice, if you don't hear your perspectives, if you never, ever see anybody who you agree with, then you got a problem. Now, you know yourself as an experienced broadcaster that that's not easy, right? Mm-hmm. Trying to find that range of perspectives and make sure you get it, because sometimes you get somebody on the right and all of a sudden you're lit up by people on the left saying, what the heck are you doing putting a dirtbag or whack job like that on, and vice versa, right? But that's what your job is, right? So you do it and do it well. But I think it's that idea that it's supposed to be serving all of us that really gets to people.
Well, it's interesting because there is conservative frustration with the CBC, and you wonder if, does one lead to the other, right? So if the Conservatives are railing against CBC, does that make CBC hostile against Conservatives? Does that make Conservatives more hostile and vice versa? Is it kind of almost a snowball effect on both sides?
Yeah, I think the real breaking point in the relationship between Conservatives, the sort of official big C Conservatives in the party, and the CBC was in the election when, I believe it was 2019, when CBC sued the Conservatives for using clips from their newscasts in their advertising. And that was like with 2 weeks to go in, what was a pretty tight election. And that was eventually thrown out by CBC's claim was eventually thrown out by the courts. But that wound never healed, and it just festers now. And the CBC may have tried, I'm not aware, but it failed to fix that. It made a mistake in doing that, and that, having crossed that bridge, there doesn't seem to be any going back.
It's interesting. South of the border, looks like they're moving ahead with some pretty big cuts at PBS and NPR. And, maybe there's a sense of relief on the part of those at the CBC or supporters of the CBC that that's not happening here, right? The Conservatives have talked about defunding the CBC. The Conservatives didn't win the election. But I don't know. Is it status quo? Is it business as usual here, do you think?
Well, it's very confusing as of today because, Prime Minister Carney promised an extra $150 million out of the gate for the CBC during the election, which was only a few weeks ago, and mused about, in the future, I'd love to see the per capita funding for the CBC move from wherever it is, $32 or $37 now to $65 like they do in Germany and the UK. And, I was reading a Toronto Star headline yesterday that said CBC's been asked to come up with how it's going to cut back. All of a sudden the government's looking for 15% cutback. So I imagine there's a fair bit of head spinning going on at the CBC right now, right? They were facing an existential threat with Poilievre, right? And then all of a sudden, hallelujah, we've been saved. And not only have we been saved, but this bright new future is ahead of us. And then a few weeks later, it's like, no, there isn't. You're looking at the biggest cut you've faced since Paul Martin was finance minister.
Is there an opportunity then maybe for a conversation about reforming CBC? Like you've written a lot over the years about what reform of the public broadcaster could look like in ways that we could change the mandate, change the structure of CBC. If the government's interested in finding some savings, does that open up that door?
It should. What it should open up, if it does open up that door, what it should be looking for, and I've tilted at this windmill for a few years now, is somebody actually taking a look at the national news industry and saying, shouldn't we have some sort of policy framework for the whole thing? And the CBC being the biggest chunk of that, I mean, 1 in 3 journalists in the country right now are employed by the CBC, right? Working what you would call legacy journalism platforms. So yes, there's an opportunity. There's always an opportunity, though, and I think as my colleague, I have a Substack called The Rewrite, as my colleague Peter Stockland wrote on it yesterday, that the CBC is kind of like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but nobody ever does anything about it, and it just seems to endure from crisis to crisis, from government to government. It sort of hunkers in and gets through each crisis and endures in what is an increasingly problematic format, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's been complaints from private media about the way in which they're forced to compete against a subsidized CBC, and that the federal government's often operating at cross purposes where they're trying to prop up private media companies, but still, posing the CBC as a bit of an obstacle. I'm curious, though, where things stand, do you think, with regard to some of these media bailouts, like the money from Google that was supposed to be there under the Online News Act, or the Online Streaming Act that was supposed to get some CanCon money out of the big tech companies? Where does all that stand now, do you think?
It's confusing right now. Like I said, with that looking to cutbacks with the CBC, I can't imagine that there's not a lot of concern in some of the newsrooms, the old print industry, where they've been enjoying subsidies via the journalism labor tax credit. I think I saw a piece by Lydia Miljan the other day that put the value at somewhere around $320 or $350 million a year in terms of private sector media subsidies. And the CRTC is looking at its news fund. That for the independent local news fund, plus the creation of other subsidies for CTV and Rogers and that. But it's all in question now. If the CBC is looking at a cutback, surely those subsidies that the private sector media are enjoying are getting a good long look as well. I can't see them staying as high as they are today. I mean, who knows? Tomorrow it could be quite different. The CRTC will probably roll along because at the end of and try to get those subsidies, but right now they're being challenged in court by people like Spotify, who are saying, "Hey, wait, this doesn't make any sense to us. We're in the music business. That's all we do, and you want to put a levy on us to pay for Rogers TV News or Chorus or whoever." So that if that fails in the courts, or even if the Online Streaming Act, which gives the CRTC those sorts of authorities over streamers, that might not survive Trump's trade negotiations. Yeah. So it is not a good time to invest in that industry. Not that there's been one lately.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, yeah, we saw, the government very quickly, in the face of some threats from Donald Trump, scrap the digital services tax. So the idea that we can just go after these big tech companies, that there's this big pot of money that we can put our hands into, maybe that was wishful thinking.
Yeah, and I mean, the whole concept actually of outsourcing your cultural funding is really problematic. There are ways. I mean, big tech companies should be taxed. Don't get me wrong. They should be, like everybody else. You can't just come into this country and start hauling billions of dollars out of it and not leave anything behind, not make a contribution. And they're aware of that. That's, the digital services tax was part of that, mishandled by the Trudeau government. But that's the concept. But you can just tax them and then spend the money, give the money to whoever you want, without going through all these legally and intellectually problematic processes that the Online Streaming Act set up.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we got all kinds of spending priorities in this country. Do private media companies or even the public broadcasters, should they be at the top of the list for those dollars?
Yeah, it's kind of like, are you a real country or not if you depend for your funding for your core cultural entities? Right. If you depend on somebody in California for that. I don't think that's a very good expression of sovereignty, right? I'm not saying the solution is easy, but I think there are solutions, and we need to retain control over that, because if you decide you're going to depend on Facebook for your funding for something, and Facebook moves on, or just decides to stop serving your country, then where are you? I mean, you're acting like a protectorate there. You're not acting like a sovereign nation, and we need to really act like one these days.
Right. And the importance of having a thriving media landscape. And look, maybe there's a role for the CBC to play in underserved communities. But I think you look across the country and there are media outlets that are thriving. There are independent media outlets that are thriving, independent journalists. You mentioned Substack that are thriving. So part of it is maybe that we're trying to prop up what's becoming an increasingly dated model and not recognizing the way the landscape is evolving.
Yeah, I mean, during a period of rapid technological change like we've been going through, and I think that's one of my big frustrations when I look at it, is that people seem to have not understood the size of the revolution we're going through, right? To me, I've used the analogy, and I think it stands up, that what we're going through is the same thing as societies were going through after the invention of the printing press. Something very, very revolutionary happened called the internet, and we're trying to figure out what comes next. And the way to do that is to inspire, through public policy, innovation, podcasts, Substacks. I mean, Substack, I just got a note from them today that they've invested another $100 million in content development, right? For people to go that way on their own, because it's kind of working. I don't know what the solution is, whether maybe that's part of a solution, but the Canadian response has been to say, oh, the old business models are broken, so here's an idea. We're going to subsidize it. Like, what the heck are you doing? You don't subsidize things that are broken. You figure out ways to create new things that will replace them.
We'll see where this all goes from here. Much more from you, as mentioned. Peter Menzies.substack.com, also the hub.ca, Macdonald-Laurier.ca. Always appreciate the insight, Peter. Thank you so much for making some time for us here today.
Hey, thanks so much for your interest, and really a lot of good luck with your new venture. Great to see.
Well, that's much appreciated. There you go. That is Peter Menzies, as mentioned, former publisher of the Calgary Herald. He's former vice chair of the CRTC, senior fellow of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the Full Press podcast. You can check that out at thehub.ca, and much more at The Rewrite, petermenzies.substack.com. It's a great insight from Peter on what's happening in the Canadian media industry these days. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. We're back after this. Welcome back. Just as we wind things down here on this episode, a couple other issues I did want to get to. One of them is the ongoing issue of Canada-U.S. trade relations. We've talked about in the last couple of podcast episodes about where things stand or whether things are close to or have been close to going off the rails. Like, for example, we talked about in the last episode the threat from Donald Trump that we're going to face 35% tariffs as of August 1st. Who knows where this is all going? Now, August 1st now is maybe seen as a new deadline. July 21st is what had been discussed before. Maybe that's now been pushed back. Maybe there's still an opportunity for Canada and the U.S. to come to some kind of agreement here and get past all of this drama. Although, why we needed all of this in the first place just doesn't make any sense, because the last time Trump was president, we got a trade deal with the U.S. We renegotiated NAFTA, CUSMA, or the USMCA, as the Americans call it. Everybody seemed happy. Everything seemed to be working fine. And along comes Trump 2.0 and its threats and tariffs and chaos and uncertainty. So, yeah, it's a lot for any Canadian leader to navigate. And that's now a responsibility that's fallen on the shoulders of this Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Now, at the same time, make no mistake, he wanted this job. He wanted that responsibility. He made the pitch to Canadians that he was the guy to take on this responsibility. He was best equipped to deal with Donald Trump. Best equipped then to get a deal with Donald Trump. So in that sense, the stakes are high here. Politically as well as economically for the Prime Minister, who still seems to be enjoying a bit of a political honeymoon, if the polls are to be believed. And there's no reason to doubt that. But here's an example where things can potentially go sideways. What if we don't get a deal with the U.S.? Or what if we get a lousy deal with the U.S.? I think to some extent Canadians recognize that, we're dealing with Donald Trump, who's unpredictable and chaotic on this stuff. But still, I think there's a lot that we ask of our leadership to do what they can to get the best possible deal. And again, it goes back to how Mark Carney framed himself or sold himself. Now, the story that came out this week, and you wonder maybe if Mark Carney is setting the stage here for some disappointment. The Prime Minister saying that trade talks are going to intensify ahead of what now I guess is the new deadline of August 1st. But speaking to reporters earlier this week, and was speaking in French when he said this, but the translated quote is, "There's not much evidence at this moment of agreements, arrangements, or negotiations with the Americans for any country, any jurisdiction to have a tariff-free deal." So whatever comes out of all of this after August 1st or whatever ends up being the deadline, we're likely still going to have some tariffs in place. And that's bad news. I mean, honestly, I think it's bad news for the Americans too, as it is bad for us. But if that's what a deal looks like, that's a disappointment. And so how much responsibility rests on the shoulders of Canada's Prime Minister, who's trying to negotiate from our point of view on all of this? So here was the question after this story emerged and a little more focus on what Mark Carney had said in French. Here's what he said the next day about where things stand and what Canada hopes or expects can come from all of this.
Look, we are in the midst of long now and tough negotiations with the United States. And we're working for the best deal for Canada. We have put in place a series of retaliatory measures, including in the steel sector. We have secured tariff-free access for a number of Canadian goods. In fact, the percentages are very high in terms of outside of the most affected sectors, steel being one of them, autos, aluminum, forest products. The vast majority of Canadian goods and services are tariff-free. That is not the case for most other countries. We will continue to work constructively for a deal, but it has to be a deal that works for Canadians and Canadian workers. And part of the reason why we don't have a deal is that deal is not yet on the table.
Is a trade deal with the U.S. likely to include some level of tariffs? And if so, will Canada impose tariffs on the U.S. as well?
Well, we'll see what the final agreement is. If there is an agreement, we're working towards an agreement in a constructive manner. And obviously, it's an agreement. There are both sides, and things will be structured accordingly. I think what's important, if I can bring it back to the situation here in the steel sector, is that the U.S. trade deals with other countries, and also the case when the U.S. doesn't have a trade deal with other countries, are going to involve very high tariffs. And one of the consequences of those very high tariffs is it pushes product, steel in this case, and their derivatives, into a Canadian market that has historically been quite open. So it's important that we protect our market from those secondary effects, if you will, from the U.S. Negotiations.
But is Canada willing to impose tariffs? Is that something on the table?
Well, Canada has imposed tariffs.
What more?
Well, on verra. We'll see. I mean, look, it's a negotiation. We believe in free trade. We believe that the best arrangements would be low tariffs. It's proven. You look at the Walters Group and the amazing work they do south of the border for some of the iconic buildings and in the United States. There actually isn't time to list them all, but many of which I know. And that's good for the U.S. It's good for Canada. Now, the U.S. has different priorities and has had different emphasis, and we have to adjust to that.
Okay, so that was the Prime Minister speaking this week. The stakes are high, obviously, when it comes to trade talks with the United States. August 1st for now remains the deadline, and we'll see what comes of all of this. But yeah, a little bit of worry, I think, given the comments from the Prime Minister this week and what a quote-unquote deal with the Americans might look like. Now, one other story I wanted to get to, just to wrap things up here today, we've got a post up on this issue at our Substack page, which you can find at robbreakenridge.ca. And it's an interesting new development on an issue that's been around for a while, not just in Canada, but in other countries. And it's whether one other country in particular that's taking this leap, that's making this change. The United Kingdom is lowering the voting age from 18 to 16. This is British Prime Minister Keir Starmer talking about the change.
I think it's really important that 16 and 17-year-olds have the vote because they're old enough to go out to work, they're old enough to pay taxes, so to pay in. And I think if you pay in, you should have the opportunity to say what you want your money spent on, which way the government should go. So I'm really pleased that we're able to bring more young people into our democracy and give them the chance to have a say over how their taxes are going to be paid and what they're going to be used for.
So understandably, this is getting a lot of attention globally, and including and maybe even especially here in Canada. This issue has come up many times. And we get into it in the piece as mentioned. You can read it, robbreakenridge.ca. There's an interesting history to all of this because 55 years ago, we actually did lower the voting age. It used to be 21, and then it was lowered to 18. And some provinces were on their own timetables. Alberta actually lowered its voting age from 21 to 19 in 1944. BC, for the longest time, kept it at 19. That didn't change until, I think, 1992. So we've changed the voting age before, and I guess there's no reason why we couldn't do so again. It is kind of arbitrary in terms of where we draw that line. It will always be arbitrary. I mean, even the UK, they're lowering the voting age. Why 16? Why not 15? I mean, that's arbitrary too. I guess the question is, what's the point? Why are we doing this? And what's the best case for where that line should be drawn? Like, yeah, when it comes to adulthood in Canada, like the drinking age is still 19 in some parts of the country. I mean, it's 21 in the U.S., even though we consider 18 to be adulthood. So it's a little bit all over the map. And then what does voting factor in? Is voting like drinking, like the drinking age, or is voting more akin to getting your driver's license? Because, of course, that's 16. There's a political factor here, too, because, look, it's the Labour Party in the UK that's making this change. Whenever it's come up in Canada, it's been, progressive politicians, whether they be Liberal, NDP, or the Green variety. And, yeah, I think there's a perception that younger voters might skew a little bit more to the left. So left-wing parties like this, conservative parties don't. They're the arguments that come up about, life experience, real-world experience. Maybe you need that before you can vote, which, I don't know, is kind of silly. Like, is there much difference in life experience, someone who's 17 and someone who's 18? Or, the whole paying taxes. Look, I mean, you could drop out of school at 16 and go work full-time and pay taxes. I don't know if that's necessarily a compelling argument. Either way. Same thing with knowledge and sophistication. Like, there's a lot of adults who are kind of clueless about government and politics. They're still allowed to vote. And, yeah, there's probably a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds who know a lot about this stuff. So I'm not sure if those should be factors as well. Here's what it comes down to for me, and it's kind of similar to the debate that came up recently. I think Calgary City Council was trying to advance the issue, and it's come up elsewhere. That right now you have to be a citizen to vote in an election. And so some have suggested, why not expand that? Why not even maybe at the municipal level let non-citizens, permanent residents, vote in elections? And to me, it comes down to this. And I think the same thing is the case when it comes to voting age. Can you run in an election? Can you hold a seat? City council, legislature, parliament. Like, in order to be an MP or an MLA or a city council, you need to be a citizen and you need to be 18. So if those are the requirements to hold office, then maybe they should be the same requirements for voting. Like, after all, I mean, someone who wins an election as a city councilor, an MLA, MP, whatever, they're one of us. We can't all go to the legislature, go to parliament and vote on everything. So we choose one of us, a representative, to go and vote on our behalf. Like, even people who want the voting age lowered, I don't think, are making the case that a 16-year-old or 17-year-old could be a member of parliament or could moonlight as a city councilor. That doesn't make sense. So drawing that line at 18, which is recognized as adulthood, you can be 18 and be an MP. I mean, it's pretty rare. I think that 18-year-olds would be elected to any office, but they can run legally. So to me, it's hard to find logic in any of this because it's so inherently arbitrary, but I just think there's a line there. And it's probably the most logical line we can find in this whole debate, which is arbitrary in so many ways. You have to be 18 to run, you have to be 18 to vote, and vice versa. So I don't think the voting age needs to change. I think it's logical to leave it as it is, to tie it to the requirement to be 18 to run for office. Now, yeah, I'll concede that, like in the U.S., I think you need to be 30 to run for the Senate. But obviously you don't need to be 30 to vote in a Senate election. But yeah, I guess that's a problem for Americans who want to defend the voting age there. I'm arguing it from a Canadian perspective. But it is significant that the UK is making this change. And look, this has come up many times in Canada. There was a private member's bill just, I think, 3 years ago that was defeated in the House of Commons. There's one senator who has tried a few times to force the issue. And I suspect that now that the UK has done it, there'll be further attempts to make the change, or at least we'll keep the issue alive in Canada. So I'm sure you're going to hear much more about it. I don't know if things will ever change here necessarily, but I'll tell you what, it'll be interesting to see how this all works out in the United Kingdom. So much more on this issue, again, at our website, our Substack, robbreakenridge.ca. Don't forget, you can find this podcast at our website as well. And in addition to podcast platforms, including but not limited to, of course, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Amazon Music. We're also on YouTube. You can find our YouTube channel at Rob Breakenridge Show. We'll be back with a new episode for you coming up on Tuesday. Also, an interesting announcement to make next week regarding a new project that I'm very much excited about. We'll have more details for you coming up on Tuesday. Again, in the meantime, more at robbreakenridge.ca. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend, folks. We'll talk to you on Tuesday. Take care.